Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as...
Better than it used to be. No one's getting institutionalized or undergoing an exorcism to remove the demons. We've left that in the past.
This is Tourette's podcast, part of the Geeks Rising Network. I'm your host, Ben Brown. All right, so this might sound like the most late to the game announcement ever, but guess what this podcast now has? It's got its own .com. I was waiting to see if the internet was something that was going to catch on and grow in popularity, and at this point in 2019, I think it has. So I went ahead and secured a website for the podcast, tourettespodcast.com, which means I don't have to tell you how to spell Libsyn anymore. You'll recall that it was tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Forget that. Just go to tourettespodcast.com here on out for all the episodes and for updates about the show and for blog posts that more people than myself will be writing. And I'm sure we'll think of a million other good ways to use it, tourettespodcast.com. And there's also a contact form on there. One way you can use it is to suggest things that might be a good fit for the site, or if you have a writing topic that you think would be good to include. Overall, I want to keep the site fairly simple and clean, but if there's something we just gotta have, then I'll see about adding it. tourettespodcast.com. Speaking of good ideas, so I want to read a short thread of tweets real quick from Jaleesa Jenkins, someone I consider a friend, someone we talked with at the beginning of Season 2, Episode 1. It remains a favorite. And she's just, I kind of truly think this podcast, or the way I go about it, or the assumptions I make as a human being who's trying to figure it all out but needs a reminder or an elbow every now and then, without that kind of thing, this podcast might have gotten a little bit off course if I didn't listen to people like Jaleesa. She's just very good at issuing reminders to, check ourselves and our assumptions, especially when it comes to the disability community and how we cast or portray people's disabilities, and how even within the Tourette community, there's some messed up viewpoints, like the one we've talked about many times about Touretters who feel the need to say, yeah, I've got Tourette Syndrome, but not the swearing kind. We've talked about that plenty of times here where, we don't have to do that. It's a misuse of energy to distance ourselves from things that we could be a lot more considerate of. Well, here's something Jaleesa wrote on Twitter that resonated. And she starts off by pointing out the substantial number of people with TS who also have an intellectual disability. That's 12%. That's a figure I've seen from the CDC. So just to clarify and set it up the right way, Tourette syndrome itself is not an intellectual disability, but... Well, let me just read from Jaleesa's timeline. She says this about the 12% of people who simultaneously have TS and an intellectual disability. Quote, that seems like a lot of people our community leaves behind and even actively excludes when we brag about how smart we all are. Sometimes we even use our intelligence as a reason we shouldn't be discriminated against or mistreated. That's kind of really messed up when you think about it. We need to do better at including people with TS and an intellectual disability. She goes on to say, in fact, in general, we need to do better at including people with Tourette's who aren't the most privileged, socially acceptable Touretters. People who are trans, who swear, who can't work, who are different races besides white, who don't speak English, etc. Touretters are diverse in every way. Our support groups, online spaces, organizations, representation, etc. should reflect that. End quote. Jaleesa, solid. As always, this podcast does not have a perfect track record on that front. And it's important to be reminded that the dominant themes of this show have been acceptance, making strange connections, and trying to better understand what you think you know, and most importantly, defeating isolation when isolation isn't what you want. You want the world to understand better so that having something like TS doesn't have to be as much of a complicated social or accessibility thing as the world makes it. Those are my words, and Jaleesa probably has a better way of saying what I'm trying to say myself, but I wanted to drop that in there today because it's important. It's not just something to keep in mind. It's an actual goal to keep thinking about the word inclusion and what it really means. If you're not following Jaleesa on Twitter already, the handle is @TwitchySpoonie. That's TwitchySpoonie. @TwitchySpoonie. Thanks, Jaleesa, and everyone who puts out messages that we can all learn from and use in our lives. Got a response from a listener named Dale. Responding to last week's episode, he says, Ben, on last week's episode, you said something about how we should stop with the Tourette's jokes. But what about Samuel Comroe? I believe you've also had at least one other stand-up comedian on your podcast who has Tourette's and tells jokes about it. Should they stop too? End quote. Dale, thanks for your question. And no, it's not the same thing. That's not what I meant. Samuel Comroe and Chris Fox is the other Touretter you're referring to. I had him on the show back in season 1. They're using their talents in making people laugh in a way that humanizes what TS is. And yeah, people without TS are in the audience laughing, but I guess I hope they're also seeing somebody own it on stage and, in front of an audience. They're there to see him or her, to see Samuel or whoever it is. And, we've got a lot of comedians in the TS community who actually work in stand-up. And humor is their way of connecting and talking about their experience. Podcasting is mine. It's something I knew how to do. I've been thinking about a photography project inspired by a fellow Touretter, photographer AJ Willette, who you might remember from season 2. We've got all these talents and channels, and in the case of Samuel and Chris and so many others, comedy is theirs. So no, I wasn't talking about them. The context was a question we had last week on how non-TS people can help the TS community, and one of my thoughts was just retiring the Tourette's jokes, just being done with them, and by that I meant the demeaning stuff. That degrading yet thoroughly, by this point, unoriginal caricature of what Tourette Syndrome is, that's all. Dale, thanks for letting me clarify that. It's actually a good question too, and maybe you guys have additional thoughts or ways of looking at this. Let me know, tourettespodcast@gmail.com. So we're here at episode 10 of season 3. Let's dive in. We have called a doctor, one with Tourette Syndrome. Clay Jones, MD, is a pediatrician who some of you might know as a contributor to the science-based medicine blog, which is quite popular, and he's also the co-host of the Prism podcast, which specializes in science, skepticism, and the perils of not being an informed or careful seeker of what should be life-improving solutions, which is not always the easiest thing to talk about because it gets... So within the Tourette community, I've heard from a lot of people who are eager to try things that might help to manage their tics because they say nothing else has worked, no legitimate prescriptions, and they're willing to try whatever might work at this point, which is understandably what can give rise to the sale of alternative remedies and inclusive of those sold from illegitimate angles. And I guess I'm saying that sometimes vulnerability like that gets exploited. And that's certainly not limited to the TS community, not by any means. But I want to start off by pointing that out because Clay and I talk about that sort of thing. You hear about a miracle cure, you hear about a remedy. How legitimate is it? What ways can we protect ourselves from these quote-unquote solutions to manage our health that may or may not be good or bad for us? Being a smarter consumer in one way, but really insightful conversation overall. And yes, plenty of talk about Tourette Syndrome. Here's me and Dr. Clay Jones.
Well, my name is Clay Jones. I am a pediatric hospitalist, which means I take care of children only in the hospital. I don't have my own practice, my own patients. I just mostly see newborns, but then I see also a fair amount of kiddos that are admitted to the emergency department for an inpatient stay.
Okay.
I'm from South Louisiana, but I've lived in Boston for the past 6 years. Followed my wife up here, who's also a pediatrician. And living the dream up in the Northeast.
Nice.
Very different way of life.
Nice. Yeah, so the transition from the South to Boston.
Had to learn what winter is.
Okay.
Had to get used to walking through snow and having years where I couldn't just wear shorts 365 days a year. That was the main thing. And then also just the amount of things to do and the proximity to other interesting places. Everything in the South is so spread out. When you live in Boston, you're like 4 hours to 6 hours from New York, Montreal, Quebec City. I mean, so many places. It's really been a nice change for myself and my family.
So working with kids and working in a hospital setting, is it kind of a general thing with kids or is it more specialized to certain things?
Well, I'm not a specialist. So it's hospitalists take care of it all when kiddos are admitted to the hospital. And mostly, probably 75% of what I do is newborns, like happy, healthy newborns. But then about 25% of what I do are kids who are sick enough to be put in the hospital. Pneumonias and, dehydration and infections that need IV antibiotics and it's a community hospital, so anything, significantly complex that really needs intimate subspecialist involvement, we often, if we can't get them to come see the kid in the hospital, we send them to Mass General Hospital or sometimes Boston Children's. So it's a lot of bread and butter pediatrics, as they say, but enough, variety to keep things interesting. Of course, you never want to be interesting to a pediatrician. You want to be nice and boring, but unfortunately, I do see some interesting cases.
Well, are you interesting to the people you treat? I mean, do they pick up on things about you that lead them to ask questions? And obviously, this is a leading question about TS, but could you pick it up from there?
Well, gosh, I hope so. Although, to be honest, but maybe on the newborn side, where actually the families are so, they're just so happy. For the most part, they've got a beautiful bouncing baby boy or girl in front of them, and those are the families where we'll chat, we'll get to know each other because I'll have them over 2 to 4 days, and then on the inpatient sick kid side, those families are often they're a little preoccupied with their kid being sick enough to be in the hospital. But I hope my personality shines through. That's the goal, is to sometimes to help alleviate concerns and anxiety by being able to add in appropriate humor.
Mm-hmm.
As far as Tourette's goes, it actually has come up a time or two, because not that Tourette's is a reason for a child to be admitted to the hospital. And of course, newborns, not diagnosing newborns with Tourette's. But I do admit patients every now and then who have Tourette's or have a tic disorder. Sometimes they're diagnosed. Sometimes they've never been diagnosed, and they're there for some other reason, right? Like, Timmy's 9 and he has pneumonia, and that's why he's in the hospital. But he also has obvious motor and vocal tics, and I have had an opportunity to talk with some patients about that, even though it may not be why they're in the hospital. And sometimes they're pretty up to speed with everything and pretty stable, and they've got a good outpatient care. And sometimes, the parents are like, "Oh yeah, we don't know why he does that or she does that," and I feel like I can plant the seed and get a conversation going. Because as you know, unfortunately, even in 2019, there's still a lot of kids out there that aren't being recognized and aren't being appropriately diagnosed and getting appropriate management. It's better than it used to be. No one's getting institutionalized or undergoing an exorcism to remove the demons.
Yeah,
we've left that in the past.
Yeah. I guess in that sense, society's tolerance and management and sort of coexistence with something like Tourette syndrome has improved quite a bit. But in recent episodes, we've been talking about the sort of empathy angle of it and having something like TS and sort of using that as a tool. We're not necessarily using it as a tool, but it affecting how you perceive things around you because you understand that people might perceive you a certain way. And that being a really good tool, I think, to relate to kids, especially, when they're developing and they're becoming people in terms of a personality and all of that. But if you have something like TS, the self-consciousness that comes with it is pretty strong, which I think it puts you in a pretty unique position as a pediatrician. If it would be, neurologist would be one thing, but I feel like any sort of line of medical work where you're dealing with kids on a pretty regular basis, just that kind of experience seems pretty powerful to me.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like other people with chronic illnesses, to more or less degree, would probably agree with what I'm about to say. But I feel like in a lot of ways, I was shaped and molded by my experience with Tourette syndrome. Really, I'm lucky, I'm privileged enough to be able to say in positive ways. And I know it doesn't unfortunately work that way for everyone. I do think it gave me and gives me insight into, there's a lot of kids out there these days dealing with anxiety and depression and bullying and, having difficulty dealing with stress in their lives, and may not see that there's an end to it, that it in many, if not most cases, it does get better. And I have had that opportunity to tell kids, I've been through something along the lines of what you're going through, and we have help for you, and we want to assist you in the process, but it does get better.
Looking at, I guess, at your background with TS and being a kid yourself, but was the manifestation of it when you were young, or when did that kind of pick up for you?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed in around the third grade. It's a little bit lost to time, but my pediatrician didn't know much about it. Suspected it, referred me to a different pediatrician in town that had a little bit more familiarity with it. Then that pediatrician referred me to a neurologist who years later I ended up working with as a pediatrician in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which was kind of nice. And she remembered me. Well, she said she remembered me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I got diagnosed around in that 7th, 8th ballpark. I had grunting. I had a lot of eye blinking and facial grimacing. I had certainly had some textural, sensory issues with the way things felt on my skin that led to some interesting interactions in class where I couldn't stand the way my shirt felt on me. I was constantly adjusting it. And before I'd know it, I'd have my shirt like up over my shoulders where my back was completely bare. And my teacher would periodically come and kind of pull it down for me.
What was it, the tag or something? Or what was that the issue?
It was just, it was a uniform. It was one of those schools, and it was just starchy and uncomfortable, as I recall. I mean, it's been a long time. I've always had mild sensory issues, primarily with the way clothes feel. It's one of those things it's hard for me to. I'm glad. Let's just put it this way. Part of why I'm a hospitalist is because I get to wear scrubs to work every day. I essentially wear work pajamas, come home and put on my home pajamas. I don't have to tuck in shirts and wear ties and all these things around my neck that used to drive me insane. So I had nothing particularly complex as far as my tics. I mean, it was mostly sniffs and grunts, noticeable but not glaring. And what mostly got me made fun of was the facial grimacing and the nose twitching and a little bit of jerking of my arm, which I still do pretty bad. In fact, I've got a shoulder injury from just like chronic overuse from jerking my left arm pretty hard. That has been tough. But overall, I mean, it's so much better than it was when I was going, school age and going through puberty, and then it really settled down as I got into later high school and college.
Well, so you mentioned Tourette syndrome and used the word positive with it.
Yeah.
Have you? What do you pull from that in terms of the sort of upside of having Tourette syndrome, or is that what you meant?
Yeah, very much so. Of course, it's always easy with hindsight and confirmation bias. Like everyone's the hero of their own story. Mm-hmm. So certainly, it's possible that these are things I've come up with to help me feel better about it. But I really don't think so. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I really think that having Tourette and going through the years of, the people kind of pointing and laughing in the hallway. There were nights where kind of, would cry to sleep because I didn't have any friends. I mean, I definitely went through periods like that.
Yeah.
But I feel like it taught me, I think you mentioned empathy, being able to understand what people are going through. It forced me, I think, to turn a little bit inward, but in a good way, and read a lot and focus on learning and expanding my mind and my brain. And so I feel like it gave me skills that I still use to this day.
Yeah, it's funny because I've thought about that the same way too. I haven't really talked about it on the podcast yet, but the kind of thing like, am I searching for positives desperately to cast it in a positive light?
Right.
Or is it something that really is just a bummer? And if would it just be the practical thing to do if there was a cure and I could take a pill? Shouldn't I just go ahead and do that? I mean, wouldn't my life be better? Am I just making up this positive stuff? But I mean, I have spent tons of time, especially since starting this podcast, about that. And I'm still at the conclusion that there's a lot of positives that I get from Tourette syndrome, even though I may not be able to directly attribute this positive thing I'm talking about directly with TS. Maybe I'm just kind of guessing, but there's
Right.
enough there to where I feel like I'm walking away a better person with it than without, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think we're on the same page in that regard. I mean,
Yeah.
again, like you said, it's impossible to assign a causal relationship between having Tourette's and these kind of positive attributes that we feel like we have. It's all correlational. And you can't run that experiment, right? There's no
Right.
clone of us that
Right.
didn't have Tourette's, where all the variables were the same, and let's see what happens. So we'll never know, but I mean, I think it's important for there to be that there are lots of people who grew up with Tourette's of varying severities, who have positive things to say and are successful in life, and to serve as, I think, a role model. I think that's good. I mean, there's so many people out there doing so many amazing things
Oh, yeah.
in the community and out of the community. But yeah, it's an unanswerable question, unfortunately.
Well, so going into high school, and so things started alleviating for you in terms of tics. Were there other aspects of, sometimes we say that, Tourette syndrome is more than just tics. There's a lot that comes with it. And we've kind of been talking about that a little bit already. But so
Yeah,
what
the
was...
sensory issues?
Yeah, the sensory issues and everything. What was your report card, I guess, with TS around the high school years and after?
Yeah. Well, I was lucky in that I've never had any really significant comorbid conditions as far as ADHD or OCD, any of those. I mean, at least not to a degree that would affect me in my normal in day-to-day functioning.
Right.
Like, I think I'm like a lot of people who don't have Tourette's. Everyone has, depending on the situation, some features of impulsivity and obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, it just doesn't meet that diagnosable criteria. But no, I got through puberty. I think life just stabilized. I think I gained a little bit more confidence in who I was. I mean, you know how adolescence is such turmoil. You're trying to figure out who you are and your place in the world, and everyone, when you're going through adolescence and even in really your early 20s, your brain's just still developing.
Right, yeah.
And I came out the other side of that with, self-esteem and confidence. I think that helps. Anything that decreases stress in general helps. Yeah. And as I'm sure you know, a fair amount of people with Tourette's do experience an improvement later in life. I mean, not everyone. And also there have been some studies looking at adults with Tourette syndrome where our ability to self-assess our degree of tics maybe isn't as good as what we think it is. When they compare self-assessment to video assessment by experts. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of people where the tics completely go away, but I do think that they improve for a lot of people.
Right.
And I'm definitely like I'm one of those. Or maybe I just don't care as much.
Yeah, that's another question I've had too. Maybe I'm experiencing as many tics as I did when I was 15 years old, but they don't stand out as much to me now because they're just kind of with me. They're there. I know they're there. They're kind of old news in a way, even though I have new tics.
Yeah.
It may not be the same set of tics I had when I was a teenager, but I still have them. And, I absolutely, over the past couple of years have felt way better about just having them and being less ashamed and being more open about it. But yeah, in general, before that too, I felt like I could say that I felt better about my tics, even though in my mind I had as many as I had when I was younger. It's just, I think I don't know, we've all kind of adapted together and it's less of a problem.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, how lucky are we that, I don't know how severe your tics are, but maybe I should say how lucky I feel that I have kind of mild to maybe just brushing up against moderate, depending on my stress level.
Yeah, same here.
I definitely occasionally get the younger child who asks, or there's someone who maybe is a little more familiar with it, who asks and is curious and has questions, and I welcome that. Of course, I'll talk to anyone's ear off.
Does it happen frequently enough to where you are? I feel like it doesn't happen to me frequently enough to where I have sort of a canned response in a way. I still have to kind of reach in and try to explain just judging by the context of the situation and everything. I'll maybe have a certain specific way of explaining exactly what they saw me do, but it just doesn't happen. I feel like I worry it's going to happen all the time, but it doesn't actually happen enough to where I'm really rehearsed enough to tell strangers what it is I'm going through. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, or is that a question you have as well? Like, what's the sort of clincher way that I can say this that people are going to get it and I don't have to draw it out too much? And it's difficult. I don't know.
Yeah, it is difficult, and it doesn't come up for me all the time. So I don't want to exaggerate that. It's kind of a handful of times over the years where someone is like in public asked me a specific question. Of course, at work it might come up because it's in a medical context, and I'm around a lot of kids. I think that when people are asking, especially if it's a child, you don't want to overburden them with pathophysiology. Like, you don't need to talk about dopamine or the caudate nucleus or the substantia nigra or anything like that.
Basal ganglia.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just enough to say that, how your brain tells your body how to move, right? You have control over how you move. Well, some people, because of differences in the way their brain is made, have a little bit less control or a lot less control over how their muscles move, or the words or sounds that their voice makes. And it's not that I or we do it on purpose. It's just something that we don't always have a lot of control over. Mm-hmm. Something like that, some X-ray level kind of stuff is, I think, enough for most children who are younger. You just talk to their level. Say, there's so many misconceptions out there. I mean, I think definitely when some people bring it up, they really just want to know, do you scream out curse words?
Right. Yeah.
Like in the movies.
Right.
Right. Like all the terrible portrayals in the media. And you can just say, that just because they show things on TV, they're trying to get a laugh or trying to portray people with Tourette as weird or funny or different, but that's just in the movies. And most people don't do that. But there are some that do, and they can't help it. And it's not always easy to treat, but whatever someone says or does, it's not, on purpose.
Yeah, that's a good point about we talk about the television or media portrayal on this podcast a lot, but I haven't really, I guess, gone over it in the way where you could just kind of say, look at a lot of stuff on TV. Look at how the movies are done. I mean, things are sensationalized. Things are not always accurate to life. And we know that about fiction stories and kind of how they work. And when true stories are adapted into a movie, it's usually kind of pumped up a bit, where they've added their own version of the truth and kind of what's going to sell. And it's just, it becomes a caricature of, the sort of thing that otherwise, if we just kind of portrayed it as it actually was, it might be kind of boring for the audience. So that's funny, because it had never occurred to me before now to kind of cast it that way of like, that version on TV, but we exaggerate everything on TV. There's a real version of it that you can learn about. And it's so funny that never crossed my mind to say it that way.
The one example I give, I gave a talk actually in last year at a conference in New York, kind of about the myths and misconceptions of Tourette syndrome, and I got a lot into the media portrayal. And there's the obnoxious Rob Schneider, Deuce Bigelow, Amy Poehler character. Like there's like the obnoxious, way over the top stuff, but there's the subtle digs. Jimmy Fallon did it, and an episode of The Tonight Show a few years ago, where it's just subtle. I think it was Blake Shelton said something surprising. unexpected. I think it was maybe a little bit crass.
Right.
And Jimmy Fallon just real quick just said, "What do you have, Tourette?" And
right.
the audience, of course, burst into laughter.
Loved it. Yeah.
And it's because they think that that's appropriate. They think that's what Tourette's is. And it's really unfortunate that you have people out there that should know better about using a medical condition as a punchline. Like, they wouldn't do that with so many other like if someone was having a coughing fit, you wouldn't say, "What do you got, asthma?"
Right.
Like, that's not, what do you have, cystic fibrosis?
Right. Yeah.
Like, that's not cool. But Tourette's it's been this long running butt of jokes.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other type of syndrome I can think of would be completely off limits in terms of just social acceptance of humor. I mean, there are things that, it crosses the line if you joke about it and people react to it, but this is the one that's still kind of slipping through as the permissible joke. And I think because, I don't know, I mean, the portrayal of it sometimes I think is just digested as something so fantastic and foreign and odd and different that it's almost so intangible and so hard to wrap your head around that it's just going to pass through as that thing. It's so difficult to understand that what else do we do with it? And I mean, this is me just totally talking in the moment, but
I think that the people who are making these jokes, like Jimmy Fallon, to go back to him, I don't think that they realize that how much this disorder primarily is affecting children.
Yeah, I agree.
I think
totally.
Yeah, like if someone said, Jimmy, like there are like 7-year-olds out there who cry themselves to sleep at night and who get picked on and bullied and beat up because they make noises and they twitch their faces or jerk their arm. Like, that's what you're making fun of. Do you think that's cool? I think Jimmy Fallon would get it. I don't know if Rob Schneider, there are some people, I don't know if they'd care, but
right, yeah.
I think Amy Poehler would get it.
I think so too. Yeah. It's either, one or two comments come in and like, oh, it's just, it's a joke. If people don't want to, if people aren't on board with it, whatever, they don't have to laugh. I think sometimes that's sort of the way it goes, or that's at least what I imagine the conversation is when any sort of complaint or correction kind of comes into somebody who makes the joke. But if there was that one-on-one, just as you said, that there are kids out there, and there's a suicide rate to kind of watch, and there's there are all these important things that we really need to kind of be careful with. We're careful about a lot of things. We need to add this one to the list, and it just put yourself in the shoes of someone who's having a really difficult time with it and can't escape the joke on TV. What do you want to be part of that? Do you want to pile on with that? And Amy Poehler, Jimmy Fallon, I totally agree that if that got to them, that wouldn't be, they would get off the TS joke. And I know we're not saying they do it all the time. There's been, we're talking about specific instances, but people like that. And then word hopefully kind of circulates a bit when they see somebody, and maybe I'm just idealizing too much, but people they work with and they hear the Tourette joke and they're like, wait a minute, yeah, I used to do that joke too. We got to stop that. It's not funny anymore. That sort of thing. And
not cool.
But yeah, I completely agree that I don't think they really mean harm with it. I think they just don't know.
No, definitely not.
I guess a lateral on awareness. You have a podcast as well, right?
I do. It's called the Prism Podcast, PRISM. Do it with a buddy of mine who's a dentist. And our kind of approach to both medicine and dentistry is very science-based, evidence-based. And we both consider ourselves very skeptical individuals, skeptic in the appropriate definition of the word, withholding judgment until you have appropriate evidence.
Right.
Asking questions, not making assumptions, not in the common usage of the term, which is often just portrayed as cynical. Like, you don't believe in anything. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
I just don't rush into judgment. And so our bent is, science communication, skepticism, critical thinking. So we do a lot of that kind of stuff, tackling pseudoscience, and consumer advocacy, trying to help give people good information, make good decisions about their healthcare choices when it comes to alternative medicine and things that maybe aren't so based on good evidence, and which that has a lot of overlap with Tourette syndrome.
Yeah.
I know.
I definitely want to talk about that because, and you said something earlier that I think is important because I've said this on the podcast before where I identify myself as a skeptic, and sometimes the perception of that is, as you said, it just means you're a cynic or you're a non-believer or you're a know-it-all.
Yeah,
and
anything, right?
And to me, if I say I'm a skeptic and someone says, "Oh, that means you're just a know-it-all," I would kind of say the opposite's true. I'll hear a claim, and doing this podcast, a lot have come my way from people who said, you should talk about this remedy, you should talk about this kind of herbal thing, and I always have to say, that's why I have the disclaimer at the beginning of the podcast that I'm not a doctor, I'm not, well researched on remedies. I know my experience, I know what I've been through, and I like asking other people what they've taken or done or what therapies or treatments they've tried to see how they've fared with it, and we'll just take it as anecdotal from there. But that stuff does come up a lot, and I kind of worry sometimes that when something gets traction that may or may not have science behind it, sometimes that isn't necessarily the alternative or the substitute. Sometimes that becomes the go-to thing, the go-to drug, and things can kind of get runaway popularity that way. The conversation about vaccines and are they dangerous or not and all that. I mean, the things will get traction, and things that are totally not mainstream and maybe under the alternative or pseudoscience banners will, kind of flourish and have life. And that part kind of concerns me because I wouldn't want anybody listening to this podcast and hear about a treatment that may or may not be legitimate, and then they spend a lot of money trying it out of maybe desperation. Because I get when people are at the point where, say I have really bad tics and they're really, really bad, and I've tried everything and nothing's working, and someone says, I spent $200 on this other stuff, this tea that I've been drinking, and it actually helps.
Or $2,000 on dental appliances.
That too, yeah.
I mean, yeah. You can spend all kinds of money.
Yeah, there's a lot. What comes across your desk frequently with Tourette syndrome when it comes to things that people are pushing? And again, I'm saying this as kind of the questioner, the explorer, and I definitely want responsible information on this podcast. But I would love to just kind of hear what you've kind of researched or looked into and found to be legit, illegitimate.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, first off, when someone proposes a treatment for Tourette, until it's been studied, it's not alternative or even pseudoscience or bogus. It's just an idea, right? It's just a hypothesis.
Sure.
And then you have to approach it from a very important angle of plausibility. So some things just on their face are so incredibly implausible that I feel comfortable saying you really shouldn't waste your time or your resources on it. Right. So homeopathy would be a good example, where it's remedies diluted past the point where they're even measurable. It's just if it were true, it would violate fundamental laws of physics and chemistry, would change everything we know about the universe. It's just it's so unlikely, it's implausible enough to where I wouldn't waste time with it. Then there are things that have plausibility, although it may not be great. I mean, various herbs, herbs are just dirty drugs. We just don't know the active ingredients. We don't know right doses. But there are things in the natural world that you can put in your body. It's going to change your physiology. Mm-hmm. We get a lot of medicines that I prescribe all the time that originated from a plant, from a tree, from a bacteria.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's kind of the difference that, because sometimes I hear people maybe kind of conflating alternative medicine and, like a natural or herbal type. I mean, like St. John's wort or something like that. I mean, there are enough, legitimate things. And, if I'm talking about, a plant drug or something, it doesn't mean it's not in the category of alternative, automatically. There's kind of a difference.
It depends.
Yeah.
Well, that's where step 2 comes in.
Yeah.
So like if you've got some baseline, you've got a hypothesis, there's some plausibility. It might change the way your body functions. Maybe some people have felt a difference, an improvement because they chewed on this bark or ate these berries or whatever it is. So then you have to do the science, right? Then you have to try to figure out, well, what's in it and what is it safe? I mean, if something cured Tourette's, but it killed 50 to 60% of the people that took it,
right?
Like, that's not a good option.
Right? Yeah.
You got to make sure it's safe. You got to see if it works. And when you get to the things that I label as pseudoscience, it's when either it's very implausible to the point where it's just not going to work, or it's got some degree of plausibility, but it's been tested and it's failed to show safety or efficacy, and even if it has some plausibility, but it hasn't really been studied, so we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got people who are saying you should try it; it
right.
will work for you. That's where you get into what I think of as pseudoscience or alternative medicine. But it's not really an alternative to medicine. That's really the marketing term. It's just things that haven't been tested or have been tested and shown to not work, but yet people still promote them. And then you've got other things like chiropractic, which you can Google it. You will find hundreds of chiropractic offices promoting their treatment for Tourette's, lots of case reports in the chiropractic literature. And then you've got dental devices, and you've got all these things with varying degrees of plausibility, but that have been studied and don't help, or have never been studied, and they're not likely to help. So that's what I write about a lot and what I research a lot. And unfortunately, Tourette's was essentially designed to fool people into thinking things that don't work. Because as you know, a lot of the symptom severity of Tourette's waxes and wanes.
Yeah.
It changes with stress levels, with caffeine intake, alcohol intake, all these variables in life, and then just the normal over time. I mean, there are months where I'm like, oh yeah, my Tourette's isn't that bad, and then there are months where I'm like, oh, it just feels like it's worse than it's been for a while. So if you try a bunch of things that aren't proven, eventually you're going to have a temporal coincidence,
right,
where you just improve because you were going to anyway, or maybe something else changes in your life that decreases stress. And that's when you started that herbal supplement and you say, oh my gosh, the herbal supplement did it.
Right.
And
so that's
where
the correlation.
People can really get into trouble. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad we're talking about this because I don't want to offend anybody who has sent me ideas or said, you got this, you talked about this one thing on the podcast one time. Well, here's something I tried or this tea or
yeah.
I'm not shooting anybody down. I'm saying that's something I would want to look into before I talk about it on the show.
Absolutely. They mean well.
Absolutely.
People just want to help other people.
Yeah, for sure. It's no one's trying to rip me off. I mean, it does come as genuine advice.
They're not selling it to you. That's when you got to.
That's important.
A little bit more wary, right?
Yeah. But in general, when it's just somebody in the Facebook group and they're saying, hey, here's something I did, it helped me to sleep a lot better, or I had really a really wonderful period of mild or reduced ticking during this time period after I tried this. I mean, maybe it did influence it, but maybe it was also something that needs to be kind of looked into further. So we don't know that it was just a coincidence that I ticked that I ticked less, because that happens all the time. Exactly as you said, it fluctuates. There are some days where I can't figure out why I'm ticking so much. Stress is usually the thing that brings it on with me, but there are so many times where either my tics are just flaring up like crazy and it's just is what it is, or sometimes I'll be stressed out and I'm not ticking quite as much. And that kind of comes as a surprise to me too, but I don't know what's what with that. I don't know what the causes are, what the factors are. I'll have to think through what I ate in the day. I mean, that sort of thing, to find any sort of commonalities with previous times where the same thing happened. And that's Just my way of saying I want to be careful about this kind of thing.
Definitely.
Yeah, just so nobody gets the wrong idea from this show or tries something that maybe is a waste of money, or at the same time, I'm not shooting down things that I don't know are it could be something completely legit that's brand new to me and I've never heard of it. I'm not going to shoot it down because I've never heard of it. I just want to know more about it. And that's why I love the way we're talking about this.
Yeah, as long as it's not dangerous.
Absolutely.
And if it's never been studied, if it's a new approach that really seems safe, then yeah, study it. So you just have to be careful about using your own or our own personal, like you said, our own personal experiences to decide that something works or something doesn't work.
When we kind of went in this direction, or when I kind of pushed this in this direction, because I really wanted to take the opportunity to talk about this kind of thing with you, because I mean you're a valuable resource with that. We kind of got away from your backstory and sort of getting into adulthood with TS. How have you found that things have persisted or not with you in your adult life?
Well, I mean, I'm successful. I'm a physician. I work with a lot of people and a lot of sometimes very stressful situations. I know that I still sick, sometimes worse than others, like we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't ever interfere with my ability to provide good patient care, to interact with people. I've never perceived that.
Right.
So, like for me, it's I'm very, and I keep saying this because I mean it's really true. I feel so lucky that I can say things like at this point in my life, it can be at times extremely annoying. There's some times when I'm just like, oh, I've got that feeling in my left shoulder that I want to just jerk my arm so bad, but it hurts and I can't do it and it drives me nuts.
Mm-hmm.
But I never go a day where I'm not aware of the tics, but it doesn't ever get me down. Yeah,
I mean, how have you found that you? And it may just be through the alleviation over the years, or just getting used to it, but to the point where you kind of feel okay about it. I mean, is it a pretty big contrast from when you were a kid and you were dealing with tics that you had to explain to your classmates and peers and all that, or I mean, obviously, it's a different set of dynamics now, but and just growing up and getting to the point where you feel like you think about your tics every day, but you're not quite as labored by them.
Right.
I guess at what point did you maybe start feeling that way?
I mean, college. I mean, when I was solidly through adolescence, and I think that the development of my brain was settling down, certainly as I got to med school.
Right.
And like we talked about before, I think a lot of it was just developing a sense of self-esteem and confidence to where I could think to myself, where this would not have been true in middle school. Oh, if someone is looking at me funny, if that person on the bus is looking at me funny because I'm ticking and it's not just all in my head, whatever. That's their problem.
Right.
And I was able to have that kind of cognition as opposed to oh my God, they're looking at me. They think I'm weird. I'm never going to get a girlfriend. But that catastrophizing train leaves the station. Yeah, I mean, I think that just getting settled in my own skin and getting settled in life, seeing that I could achieve things and do things where that it wasn't holding me back, and it just became on a lot of days just part of that kind of background. And like a lot of things, just like now I have a hurt shoulder that I've had for 2.5 years,
mm-hmm.
and it's annoying, but it's just in the background. I can live my life. I can do really everything I used to do before. Just now I notice my shoulder achy. So for me, it's kind of like that.
Yeah.
And again, I'm so incredibly lucky that I don't have more severe tics. I've never felt the need to try a pharmaceutical intervention. And I know others don't have it as lucky as I am.
Well, have you identified any other, the sort of the hereditary angle, I guess, on TS? Have you spotted that elsewhere in your family?
I haven't. I have two daughters,
Mm-hmm.
and that was something that did cause me a significant amount of stress.
Yeah.
They're now 10 and 14, and neither of them have any signs.
Okay. Yeah.
So, as you know, can't say I'm out of the woods, especially with the 10-year-old. But being that they're female, so typically tend to have less severe tics. Of course, not every girl with Tourette's has mild tics, but in general, they tend to be less severe. I'm feeling better and better that they're not going to have issues at this point. But yeah, that was something that worried me. I know the inheritance patterns are complex, and it's not so much like, I think we used to think it was 50% chance you're going to have it,
right?
If your parents has, and it's not so much like that. And there's so much differences in penetrance and how severe the presentation is. But no, neither of my parents have it. We don't know of anyone else in my family. So it really does appear to be sporadic with me. But it gets swept. Historically, it would get kind of not recognized. That was just a weird kid. So it's certainly possible that there were milder cases I just don't know about that didn't get diagnosed.
Yeah. Well, it just makes me think that, in the event that there was a diagnosis or signs crop up, I mean, I think about this all the time, that everybody who I have talked to on this podcast is in a really beautiful position to help that person develop in the world and kind of fare it easier than maybe you or I had. And,
it would be totally different.
Yeah. I mean, even having mild cases, even a mild case can be, fairly traumatic for someone who, is made an example of in school.
Absolutely.
Or, it's just,
absolutely.
It's just, it doesn't always have to track, with the frequency of tics. Mild case can be pretty severe for somebody. And I just like the idea that any of us talking on here, any guest I've had in the past, you included, obviously, are in a really, really good place to help somebody else out in the world who, may need that.
Right. And the more people are aware of it, the more people will be that are in a good place if it were to pop up. It's nice that awareness really seems to be increasing over the past decade. It's so different, I think, from the 80s when I was diagnosed.
Yeah.
And Lord, before then, like we talked about.
Oh, yeah.
Before.
Let's sort of put it in a capsule real quick as kind of a party favor, so to speak. If someone's listening, they hear about something that, it sounds really great. It's, it's some kind of new treatment. It's some kind of new drug. It kind of falls in line with other things that we might kind of call alternative medicine. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Don't know. But what are some of the basic sort of approaches or questions that you think someone can ask that would maybe kind of help them to maybe better determine what's legit or not, or what merits further exploration?
Right. Well, I think, where did the idea come from? Was it just something one person invented who just happens to be selling it? That's a red flag.
Yeah.
Or was it something that's being worked on in a university, through legitimate sources, the NIH? Are there studies? Are there basic science studies to show that it may, work on just from a fundamental plausibility level? Are there trials using placebo-controlled arms? Try to sort out those things we talked earlier about the waxing and waning course, and how you can get fooled into thinking something works. And, and always be wary of things that cost a lot of money. Because unfortunately, I'm always I'm torn, because a lot of pharmaceutical agents cost a lot of money too. But, ideally they have the evidence to back them up, and at least a nuanced understanding of what the side effects and the risks are as well.
Right.
There's a lot of, something just that if someone just tells you, oh, it works and there's no risk, it's amazing, it's a miracle, just, I would be skeptical.
Right. And skeptical doesn't mean saying no. It just means, you want to look into this a little bit further, talk to some people who may have some concrete knowledge about this kind of thing before you move forward.
absolutely talk to your doctor, your neurologist, your pediatrician or internal medicine doctor, whoever you trust. I'll put a plug in for sciencebasedmedicine.org. We write a lot about how, regular folks out in the community can interpret press releases and advertisements, and you can get a real education on how to approach claims of therapies if you kind of become a regular reader.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Dr. Clay Jones for giving us some of his busy schedule. Tell me what you guys thought about that conversation. Do you have any stories about, trying a remedy for your TS that ended up being totally bogus? I mean, this is not to pick on anybody for any decision they've made in their tic management or OCD management or any kind of treatment. It's just to kind of highlight the importance of this kind of thing for a minute, so we at least acknowledge that we as a population of people frequently looking for relief of some kind may find things that purport to, I don't know, you guys get it. We just listened. I want to thank you for being here. This podcast is a learning opportunity for me, and I hope it is for you too. But if there's something I'm getting wrong, call me out. Let me know, tourettespodcast@gmail.com. And please check out the new site, tourettespodcast.com, where you can get all the episodes and read blog posts from me and from guest writers. If you would like to contribute, by the way, if you like to write, you have a good idea for a blog or just something related to Tourette Syndrome, but reach out, pitch me, tourettespodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram, just search for Tourette's Podcast, @Tourette'sPod on Twitter. And if you'd like to join the amazing group of people supporting this podcast, head to patreon.com/Tourette's Podcast. And I'm eternally grateful. We'll see you next Friday with episode 11 of season 3. Thanks again. This is Ben.